The sledgehammer trembled in Ethan Caldwell's hands, its weight heavier than the splintered beams of his father's house. He stood in the gutted living room, where dust danced in slants of dawn light, and the ghosts of his past whispered from every cracked floorboard. He'd sworn to tear it all down, to erase the home that had bankrupted his dreams. But then he walked in. Ethan had been an architect once, a rising star in Boston's cutthroat design scene, sketching buildings that seemed to breathe. His father, Richard, a stubborn traditionalist, had scoffed at Ethan's modern designs, calling them soulless. Their fights had carved deeper scars than any blueprint, and when Richard died 2 years ago, he left Ethan this crumbling Victorian mansion in Willow Creek, Massachusetts, a relic of pride and a mountain of debt. Ethan, now 32, had poured every cent into saving it, only to lose his career, his savings, and his hope. The house was his last tie to a man he'd never understood, and today, it was set to be sold to the highest bidder. The bidder arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, stepping out of a sleek black car that looked absurdly out of place on the dirt road. Lucas Harper was tall, with neatly cropped blonde hair and eyes like a summer sky. His tailored suit screamed money, but his smile was warm, disarming. "Ethan Caldwell?" he asked, extending a hand. "I'm here for the house." Ethan shook his hand, feeling the roughness of his own calluses against Lucas's smooth skin. "It's a fixer-upper," Ethan warned, gesturing to the sagging porch and peeling paint. "Hope you're ready for a project." Lucas's gaze lingered on Ethan, not the house. "I'm good with projects," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. Ethan felt a jolt, like a spark from a frayed wire, but he brushed it off. He had no time for distractions, not when he was drowning in debt and desperation. They toured the house, Lucas asking questions that seemed oddly personal, about Ethan's childhood, his father's quirks, the memories etched into the walls. Ethan answered curtly, his heart heavy with the weight of letting go. The house was a mausoleum of regret. The kitchen where he'd argued with his father over his unnatural choices, the attic where he'd hidden his first sketchbooks, the bedroom where he'd cried himself to sleep after coming out at 17. Selling it felt like betraying his own history, but keeping it was financial suicide. Lucas paused in the dining room, running a hand over a warped oak table. "This place has soul," he said. "Why are you selling it?" Ethan stiffened. "Because I'm broke, and it's falling apart." Lucas turned, his eyes searching Ethan's face. "Some things are worth fixing." The words hit harder than they should have. Ethan looked away, his throat tight. He didn't need pity, especially not from a rich stranger who'd probably flipped the house for profit. But Lucas didn't push. Instead, he offered to buy Ethan coffee at the town's only diner, claiming he wanted to understand the property better. Against his better judgment, Ethan agreed. The diner was a time capsule of checkered floors and jukebox tunes. Over greasy coffee, Lucas revealed he was a real estate developer from New York, specializing in historic restorations. "I don't just buy houses," he said, leaning forward. "I save them, and I think this one's worth saving." Ethan snorted. "Good luck. It's a money pit." "Maybe," Lucas said, his smile unwavering. "But I'm not just interested in the house." Ethan froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Lucas's gaze was steady, unflinching, and Ethan felt that spark again. Dangerous, electric. He wanted to laugh it off, to call it a misunderstanding, but the air between them crackled with something undeniable. For the first time in years, Ethan felt seen, not as a failure, not as a bankrupt architect, but as a man. That night, alone in the house, Ethan couldn't sleep. Lucas's words echoed in his mind, mingling with memories of his father's disapproval. Richard had never accepted Ethan's sexuality, calling it a phase, a sin, a betrayal of the Caldwell name. Ethan had spent years proving himself through his work, only to lose it all. Now, a stranger's fleeting interest threatened to unravel the walls he'd built around his heart. The next morning, Lucas returned with a contract. "I'll buy the house," he said, But on one condition. Ethan braced himself. What? I want you to stay on. Help me restore it. Ethan laughed, bitter and sharp. I'm not a charity case. It's not charity, Lucas said, stepping closer. I've seen your designs online. You're brilliant. This house deserves you. Ethan's breath caught. No one had called him brilliant in years. He wanted to say no, to walk away from this man and his unsettling intensity, but the thought of saving the house, of saving himself, was too tempting. He nodded, unsure if he was signing a deal or something far more dangerous. Over the next week, they worked side by side, tearing out rotted wood and sanding down history. Lucas was relentless, his energy infectious. He'd show up at dawn with coffee and blueprints, his enthusiasm chipping away at Ethan's defenses. They talked about everything: art, music, the way light hit a building just right. Ethan found himself laughing, something he hadn't done in months. Lucas's touch lingered. A hand on his shoulder, a brush of fingers when passing a tool, and each time, Ethan's heart raced. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lucas turned to him. Why'd you give up architecture? Ethan stared at the horizon, the ache in his chest raw. I didn't give up. It gave up on me. After my dad died, I sank everything into this place. Lost my clients, my reputation, everything. Lucas reached for his hand, his grip firm but gentle. You're not done, Ethan. Not even close. The warmth of Lucas's hand spread through him, igniting something he'd buried long ago. He pulled away, standing abruptly. I can't do this, he muttered, retreating into the house. He wasn't ready. Not for this, not for someone like Lucas who saw too much and asked for more. But Lucas didn't give up. He showed up every day, patient but persistent, his presence a quiet challenge to Ethan's fears. And as the house began to transform, new beams, fresh paint, a roof that didn't leak, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Maybe he wasn't as broken as he thought. Maybe some things, like Lucas said, were worth fixing. The hammer in Ethan's hand felt lighter now, but his heart was heavier than ever. Each swing into the rotting wood of his father's house chipped away at the past. Yet Lucas's presence built something new, something Ethan wasn't sure he could trust. The Victorian mansion in Willow Creek was no longer just a crumbling relic. It was a battleground for his fears and a flicker of hope he didn't dare name. Lucas had become a constant, arriving each morning with a disarming grin and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They worked in sync, ripping out decayed floorboards and replacing them with oak that gleamed like a promise. Lucas's knowledge of restoration was impressive, but it was his quiet confidence that unnerved Ethan. He'd catch Lucas watching him. Not the house, not the work, but him, with an intensity that made Ethan's skin prickle. One afternoon, as they wrestled with a stubborn window frame, Lucas's shoulder brushed against Ethan's. The contact lingered, deliberate, and Ethan's breath hitched. You're good at this, Lucas said, his voice soft but pointed. Better than you give yourself credit for. Ethan stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow to hide his unease. Just trying to get this done so you can flip the place and move on. Lucas's smile faltered. Is that what you think I'm doing? Flipping it. Aren't you? Ethan shot back, his voice sharper than intended. You're a developer. This is what you do: buy low, sell high. Lucas set down his tools, his blue eyes steady. I told you, Ethan, I don't just buy houses. I save them. And I'm not here to move on. The air grew thick, charged with words neither dared to speak. Ethan turned away, focusing on the window frame as if it could anchor him. He wasn't ready for this, for Lucas's sincerity, for the way it made his chest ache with something other than grief. He'd spent years guarding himself against his father's judgment, against the world's rejection. Letting Lucas in felt like stepping onto a frozen lake, waiting for the ice to crack. That evening, they sat in the backyard, the summer air heavy with the scent of wildflowers. The house loomed behind them, half restored, its silhouette softened by twilight. Lucas pulled out a sketchbook revealing drawings of the house, not as it was, but as it could be. Arched windows, a wraparound porch, a garden where the overgrown weeds now stood. "This is what I see," Lucas said, handing the sketchbook to Ethan. "What do you see?" Ethan traced the lines with his finger, his architect's instincts stirring. The design was bold, respectful of the house's history but unafraid to reimagine it. "It's beautiful," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's a fantasy. I can't afford to dream like this anymore." "You can?" Lucas said, his hand brushing Ethan's as he took the sketchbook back. "You just need someone to believe in you." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to push Lucas away, but the warmth in Lucas's voice was a lifeline he couldn't ignore. They sat in silence, the space between them shrinking until their shoulders touched. For the first time, Ethan didn't pull away. The next day, a storm rolled into Willow Creek, forcing them inside. Rain battered the roof, leaking through the tarp they'd rigged over the attic. As they scrambled to patch it, their laughter echoed in the empty house, a sound Ethan hadn't heard in years. Lucas slipped on a wet floorboard, and Ethan caught him, their faces inches apart. For a moment, time stopped. Rain drumming, hearts pounding, the world narrowing to the space between them. "Ethan," Lucas murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I'm not just here for the house." Ethan's pulse raced. He wanted to lean in, to close the gap, but fear clawed at him. "You don't know me," he said, stepping back. "You don't know what a mess I am." "I know enough," Lucas replied, his eyes unwavering. "And I'm not scared." The words lingered, heavy and true, as they returned to work. But the storm had changed something. Ethan felt it in the way he caught himself watching Lucas, in the way his hands lingered when they passed tools. He was falling, and it terrified him. By the end of the week, the house was taking shape. New windows gleamed, the porch no longer sagged, and the walls stood straighter, prouder. Ethan saw his father's house in a new light, not as a burden, but as a canvas. Lucas had done that not just with money or skill, but with a belief in Ethan that felt like a second chance. One night, as they sat by a makeshift fire in the living room, Lucas opened up. He'd grown up in a small town like Willow Creek, hiding who he was to fit in. "I spent years building walls," he said, staring into the flames. "Then I realized walls don't keep you safe. They just keep you alone." Ethan's chest ached. He knew about walls, had built them higher than this house. But Lucas was dismantling them, brick by brick, with every glance, every touch. When Lucas reached for his hand, Ethan didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and for the first time, Ethan let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, he could be more than a bankrupt architect. The house was no longer a ruin, but Ethan's heart was still a construction zone. Each day with Lucas felt like laying a new foundation, yet the fear of collapse loomed over every moment. As the Victorian mansion in Willow Creek began to shine, Ethan wondered if he could rebuild himself, or if he'd crumble under the weight of his past. Lucas had become a force of nature, his optimism cutting through Ethan's doubts like sunlight through fog. They worked late into the nights, painting walls and refinishing floors, their conversations weaving through laughter and quiet confessions. Ethan learned Lucas wasn't just a polished developer. He'd clawed his way out of a conservative upbringing, where being openly gay was a risk he'd taken too late. "I lost people," Lucas admitted one evening, sanding a banister. "Family, friends. But it taught me to hold on to what matters." Ethan envied that clarity. His own coming out had been a war, his father's silence louder than any shout. Richard Caldwell had loved this house more than his son, or so it felt, and Ethan had spent years proving he was enough. Now, with Lucas, he wondered if he'd been fighting the wrong battle. One morning, a delivery truck arrived with custom windows Lucas had ordered. Ethan watched him negotiate with the driver, his charm effortless, and felt a pang of something deeper than gratitude. Lucas wasn't just saving the house, he was saving Ethan, piece by piece. But the closer they grew, the louder Ethan's fears screamed. Lucas was successful, whole, while Ethan was a man who'd lost everything. What could he offer someone like that? The turning point came on a humid August afternoon. They were in the attic, sorting through boxes of Ethan's father's things. Old photos, blueprints, letters yellowed with age. Ethan found a sketch he'd drawn at 15, a futuristic house with soaring lines. His father had called it childish, but Lucas held it like a treasure. "This is incredible," he said. "You were born for this, Ethan." Ethan's eyes stung. "My dad didn't think so." Lucas set the sketch down, his expression fierce. "Your dad was wrong. You're not just an architect. You're an artist." The words cracked something open in Ethan. He turned away, pretending to sort papers, but Lucas stepped closer. "Stop running," he said softly. "You don't have to prove anything to me." Ethan's hands shook. "I'm not running. I don't know how to do this." Lucas's hand found his, steady and warm. "You don't have to know. Just be here." For a moment, Ethan let himself be. They stood in the attic, surrounded by dust and memories. And when Lucas leaned in, Ethan didn't pull away. Their lips met, tentative at first, then hungry, a collision of longing and fear. The kiss was a promise, a risk, a beginning. But beginnings are fragile. The next day, a lawyer arrived with papers Ethan hadn't expected. The house's title had complications, back taxes, liens, debts his father had hidden. Selling it outright was impossible without settling the accounts, and Ethan didn't have the money. He stood on the porch, the papers crumpled in his fist, as panic clawed at him. "I should have known," he muttered. "This place is cursed." Lucas read the documents, his jaw tight. "It's not cursed. It's just a mess. We'll figure it out." Ethan snapped. "This isn't your problem." Lucas's eyes flashed. "It's ours. I'm not walking away." The fight that followed was quiet but brutal. Ethan accused Lucas of pity, of playing savior to a broken man. Lucas fired back, calling Ethan stubborn, too proud to accept help. They parted angry, the house silent for the first time in weeks. Ethan spent the night alone, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd pushed away the one person who saw him. The next morning, Lucas returned, his expression softer but resolute. "I'm not giving up on this," he said, gesturing to the house and to Ethan. "But you need to decide if you're in or not." Ethan wanted to be in, more than he'd ever wanted anything. But the house, the debts, his father's shadow, they loomed like storm clouds. He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm in." They tackled the legal mess together, Lucas's connections opening doors Ethan couldn't. They met with bankers, lawyers, even the town's historical society, who offered grants to preserve the house. Slowly, the impossible became possible. And as they fought for the house, Ethan fought for himself, letting Lucas in, letting hope Indiana. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, they sat on the newly restored porch. Lucas traced circles on Ethan's hand, his voice low. "This house isn't just yours anymore," he said. "It's ours." Ethan's heart swelled. For the first time, he saw the house not as a burden, but as a home, a place where he could be whole. He leaned into Lucas, their shoulders pressed together, and felt the weight of his past begin to lift. The Victorian mansion stood prouder now, its fresh paint glowing under the September sun. But Ethan's heart was still a work in progress. Lucas had become his anchor, yet the fear of losing him, of losing this fragile new beginning, gnawed at Ethan like dry rot in old wood. Every step toward love felt like a step toward a ledge, and Ethan wasn't sure he could survive the fall. Their days were a rhythm of restoration and revelation. They refinished the grand staircase, each step a testament to their growing trust. Lucas shared stories of his past, failed relationships, the loneliness of hiding who he was, and Ethan began to open up about his own. He talked about the nights he'd spent sketching in secret, dreaming of buildings that could change the world. Lucas listened, his eyes bright with belief, and Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, possibility. But possibility came with pressure. The house's debts were shrinking, thanks to Lucas's savvy and the Historical Society's grants. But Ethan's pride was a stubborn stain. He hated relying on Lucas, hated the feeling of being saved. One afternoon, as they installed new crown molding, Ethan's frustration boiled over. "I don't want to be your project," he said, his voice tight. "I'm not some broken thing you need to fix." Lucas lowered his hammer, his expression calm but firm. "You're not a project, Ethan. You're a partner. But you keep acting like you're in this alone." The words stung because they were true. Ethan had spent so long fighting solo, against his father, against failure, that he didn't know how to share the load. He muttered an apology, but the tension lingered, a crack in their foundation. That evening, Lucas suggested they take a break and visit a local art fair in Willow Creek's town square. Ethan agreed, desperate for a distraction. The fair was alive with color. Paintings, sculptures, music drifting through the air. Lucas bought them both ice cream, and they wandered the stalls, their shoulders brushing. At a booth displaying architectural sketches, Lucas nudged Ethan. "You should be here," he said, pointing to a drawing of a sleek modern building. "Your work belongs in places like this." Ethan's chest tightened. "That was a long time ago." "It doesn't have to be," Lucas said, his voice fierce. "You're still that guy, Ethan. The one who dreams big." The words hit like a spark to kindling. Ethan wanted to believe them, but doubt was a heavy anchor. He turned away, pretending to study a painting, but Lucas's hand found his, pulling him back. "Don't hide," Lucas said softly. "Not from me." They stood there, surrounded by the hum of the fair, and Ethan felt the walls he'd built begin to crumble. He squeezed Lucas's hand, a silent promise to try. The next day, disaster struck. A pipe burst in the basement, flooding the newly laid floors. Ethan stared at the water, his stomach sinking. "This is why I wanted to tear it down," he said, his voice hollow. "It's always something." Lucas grabbed a bucket, already moving. "Then we fix it. Together." They spent hours mopping up the mess, their clothes soaked, their hands raw. By midnight, the basement was dry, but Ethan was drained. He slumped against the wall, his eyes burning. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why stay?" Lucas knelt in front of him, his hands on Ethan's knees. "Because I see you, Ethan. Not just the house, not just the architect. You. And I'm not going anywhere." The words broke something in Ethan. He pulled Lucas close, their foreheads touching, and let the tears come. For his father, for his failures, for the man who refused to let him fall. They kissed, slow and deep, the taste of salt and hope mingling in the damp basement air. The weeks that followed were a blur of progress. The house was nearly complete, its rooms filled with light and potential. Ethan started sketching again, small designs at first, then bolder ones inspired by Lucas's belief. One night, he showed Lucas a drawing of the house reimagined as a community center. A place for art, for healing, for people like them who'd felt out of place. Lucas's eyes lit up. "This is it," he said. "This is what the house should be." Ethan nodded, his heart full. The house wasn't just his father's anymore. It was theirs, a symbol of what they could build together. But as the final days of restoration loomed, Ethan couldn't shake the fear that Lucas would leave once the project was done. Love, like architecture, required faith, and Ethan's was still a work in progress. The Victorian mansion gleamed under the autumn sun, its scars hidden beneath fresh paint and new dreams. Ethan stood on the porch, his hands tracing the smooth railing, and felt a pride he hadn't known in years. But as the house neared completion, the question of what came next, for him, for Lucas, for them, hung heavier than the hammer he'd set down. Lucas had changed everything. The man who'd arrived to buy a house had stayed to rebuild Ethan's heart. Their days were filled with laughter, their nights with quiet moments that felt like home. Yet Ethan's fears lingered, whispering that love this good couldn't last. He'd lost too much to believe in forever, but Lucas's steady presence made him want to try. One morning, as they hung the final chandelier in the foyer, Lucas turned to Ethan with a grin. "We did it," he said, his voice warm with triumph. "This place is alive again." Ethan nodded, but his smile was tight. The house was finished, but what did that mean for them? Lucas had a life in New York, a career that didn't belong in Willow Creek. Ethan couldn't ask him to stay, not when he had nothing to offer but a broken past and a fragile hope. That afternoon, Lucas suggested a walk by the river that ran through town. The water sparkled under the crisp September sky, and they sat on a bench, their hands entwined. Lucas pulled out a folder, his expression nervous, a rarity for him. "I have an idea," he said, handing Ethan a set of plans. Ethan's breath caught. The plans were for the house, not as a private home, but as a community center, just like he'd envisioned. Classrooms for art, spaces for support groups, a garden for quiet reflection. Lucas had taken Ethan's sketch and turned it into reality, complete with funding proposals and partnerships with the Historical Society. "This is your dream," Lucas said, "but I want it to be ours. I'm not leaving, Ethan. I want to stay with you with this." Ethan's eyes burned. He'd spent so long running from his past, from his father's judgment, from his own failures. But Lucas saw him, not as a bankrupt architect, but as a man worth loving. "I don't know how to do this," Ethan admitted, his voice raw. "I'm scared I'll mess it up." Lucas cupped his face, his touch steady. "Then we'll mess it up together. I love you, Ethan. That's not going anywhere." The words hit like a cornerstone slotting into place. Ethan kissed him, fierce and desperate, pouring every fear, every hope into it. The river flowed beside them, a witness to a promise neither could break. The grand opening of the Willow Creek Community Center was a month later. The house buzzed with life. Locals, artists, kids running through the garden. Ethan stood at the podium, Lucas at his side, and spoke about second chances, about building something new from the ruins of the past. His voice shook, but Lucas's hand on his back kept him steady. Afterward, they stood on the porch watching the crowd. Ethan's father's house was no longer a burden. It was a legacy, a place where people could find what he'd found with Lucas. Acceptance, love, a place to belong. "You saved this," Ethan said, turning to Lucas. "You saved me." Lucas smiled, his eyes bright. "We saved each other." As the sun set, casting the house in gold, Ethan felt the weight of his past lift. He wasn't just an architect, not just a son who'd failed, not just a man who'd lost everything. He was Ethan Caldwell, loved and whole, standing beside the man who'd chosen him, not the property, but the person. And together they'd built something that would last.